when you talk about characterization in literature, we are not just talking about what is written, but what we can readily identify even in films. So of course, a lot of us have been, maybe all of us, no, we are into films, we are into movies, we are into series. And kapag nanonood tayo ng mga palabas na to, alam natin na unang nakaka-identify tayo ay yung mga characters. So we do not easily identify with the setting, 'di ba? Hindi ka naman manonood ng palabas sa pelikula tapos ang hahanapin mo una ay yung setting, 'di ba? Una mo nga hanapin yung kalaban, 'di ba? The kontrabida, ano yung character development na mangyayari. So just to give us a basic understanding of characterization, characterization is the process by which a writer makes his character come to life, and we've been emphasizing that ever since. Okay, so we get to know a character's trait either through the narrator or through his or her actions. In the same manner, we get to know real people. The character in literature is the most humanistic element. That's why we readily identify with the character. Through the experiences of the character, um, we know that there is what we call vicarious experience. So pag sinabi nating vicarious experience, what we're saying is that we experience or feel the experiences of the characters. So we call it in literature, again, vicarious experience. So I think I've said that before, but just for the sake of refreshing our understanding of it, the reason we identify, the reason we feel the pain, the sufferings, all of the struggles of the character in a film or in a short story, it's because of vicarious experience. In our word literature class, if you're part of that, we talked about it as the significant human experience. Okay, so Aristotle talks about what we call mimesis. Okay, mimesis or imitation. Now, when you talk about imitation, di ko alam kung part kayo ng word lit class ko, but I'll share it anyway. When you talk about imitation, what Aristotle was saying is not a literal copy, but a representation. And characters are imitation or representation of reality. Characters in literature are what we call vicariously experienced reality. Okay, so they are mimesis of real human being. That's why it's always debatable for, let's say, fictionists and literary scholars to say that the term fiction is equivalent to unrealistic. Some people would synonymously say, fictional yan. Ibig sabihin, hindi yan totoo. But that's the problem. We popularly know fiction as something that is not real. But when you go deeper to what fiction is through their elements, you know that fiction, vis-a-vis characters, these are imitation or representation or mimesis of reality. So hindi natin pwedeng sabihin fiction is not real. It's always debatable. Fiction is a product of reality. So maybe not use the term fiction kapag ibig mong sabihin ay hindi totoo. So maybe, look for another term. But don't use fiction, especially for you English majors or literature students. Okay? So that's a basic understanding on characters. Now, for the sake of those who are taking this course as their only literature course, because we know that Philippine Literature in English is a merge of the new curriculum major and the old curriculum GE. Okay, this is considered as a general education course for the other majors. Okay, so just for the sake of basic understanding, I want to lay down basic terminologies that I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with already. Of course, we know protagonist. Protagonist is the lead character in a story. It is also called hero in film and drama. Okay, now just to be technical about this, since you are literature students, not all bida are called protagonist. Okay, the term protagonist is very specific for literary text. That means novels, short stories, or novelette, yung medyo mahabang short story. Okay, so pag written, that's what we call protagonist. That's the lead character in the written literature. When you say hero, that is for action. So that means either you're watching a drama, a theater play, or you are watching a film. In film or in anything that is acted, you do not call them technically protagonist anymore. You call them hero. The hero of the story. Of course, hindi naman siya mali pag sinabi mong the protagonist in the K-drama or the protagonist in the series I'm watching. Okay lang din naman. That's popularly accepted. But to be technical about it, we know that protagonist is for literature. It's a term, a literary term, and hero is a term for the acted part of literature. That means theater and film. Kaya nga, in Aristotle's Greek tragedy, Oedipus Rex is called the tragic hero. Okay, hindi siya tinawag na the tragic protagonist. Okay, because play or drama is acted. So don't forget that simple difference. Okay, so protagonist is the lead character, the antagonist is the opposite of the lead. So that means the contravida, the kalaban. Okay, we are calling it villain in play or in drama, and in films, in movies, we call it villain if it's acted out. So the villain is the contrabida, the protagonist, the antagonist. Now, a special character in literature is called foil. And I'm sure narinig nyo na to before in your other literature classes sa mga English majors. Now, for the rest of everybody, let me just clarify what foil is. A foil is a character that is created to contrast the main character and help them to shine. It highlights the opposing traits of another character. So the foil is not the protagonist nor the antagonist of the story. The foil, rather, is not also an extra. Hindi siya yung napadaan lang sa palabas or sumingit lang sa short story. But the foil is specifically made to contrast the character of either the protagonist or the antagonist. Anong ibig sabihin nun? It means that if, for example, your protagonist is depicted as a character who is like Maria Clara, let's say, mahinhin, maamo, paladasal, so very religious, prim and proper. So you will put a foil in the story to highlight the opposite of Maria Clara. Para ma-highlight yung kabutihan ni Maria Clara, kailangan itabi mo siya, i-associate mo siya sa opposite niya. Not necessarily the antagonist. That's a foil. So that means pwedeng magkaroon siya ng kaibigan, let's say, na hindi religious, na ano bang opposite ng hindi ng mahinhin? Yung, I don't know, basta wild, ganun. So that means pag pinagtabi mo sila, ma-highlight lalo yung kabutihan ni Maria Clara kasi meron siyang friend or meron siyang family member, let's say, na or kasama sa story na opposite niya. So that's a foil. So its purpose is to highlight the character of the main, either the protagonist or the antagonist. Okay? So para ma-contrast at let the character shine. I hope I made that clear. I'll give you an example in Philippine literature. We know Ibong Adarna. If you have, if you've gone through your junior high school, pinagdaanan nyo to, I guess. Alam natin na in Ibong Adarna, we have three brothers. Si Don Juan, si Don Pedro, at si Don Diego. Okay? Now, we know that the main character here or the protagonist is Don Juan. Okay, so let's try to describe Don Juan. He's the youngest of the siblings. He is a man of integrity and compassion, and these good qualities makes him the king's favorite child. So that's Don Juan. Now, how will you use Don Pedro and Don Diego as a foil to highlight the character of the protagonist or of Don Juan? Okay, let's try to take a look at the opposite. So we know that Don Pedro is the eldest son of the king and queen. He is a deceitful man, very envious and greedy of power. So medyo garapal siya, medyo sakim sa kapangyarihan. And because of that characteristic, it is obviously the opposite of the protagonist. So what happens is naha-highlight lalo yung kabutihan ni Don Juan because meron siyang kasamang hindi mabuti. So yun yung intention ng writer doon, to highlight the opposite of the character and make the character shine. Another one is Don Diego, the second son. He does not have his own decision. He follows whatever his older brother, Don Pedro, tells him to do. So sunod-sunuran naman siya. So having said that, it highlights again Don Juan as the main character because pag tinabi mo siya kay Don Diego, indecisive, magulo ang utak, walang sariling desisyon, you know that Don Juan will shine because he is exactly the opposite of the two. So again, these two characters are not totally the villain, but they are considered foil. They are considered there to highlight the character of the main character. Now, how do we make it in terms of example para mas maintindihan natin si foil? How many of you are, obviously you don't have to answer, no, but how many, I'm sure most of you are familiar with Popoy and Basha. Okay, we know anong title nito. One More Chance. Okay, so when you look at the movie, you know that there are two main characters, si Popoy at si Basha, and there are several friends. These friends in the film can be considered foil in the story. Paano natin nasabing foil? Kasi a lot of what is missing from Popoy and Basha are actually in the traits of this character. So it highlights, for example, their plans. Yung mga friends niya, di ba, may mga konkretong plano sa buhay, may mga career silang binubuo, masaya yung love life nila, somehow, not all though. But those things are the ones missing from the partner, si Popoy at si Basha. That's why ang gulo ng career nila, ang gulo ng love life nila. So the friends were there not just to be a support system to the couple, but also to highlight what is missing. That's why these friends are the ones giving advice about career, about relationship, because they are considered foil in the story. So if you are an aspiring writer, probably in the future, why not dream big? Okay, so this is how you create your characters in your stories, in your future writing, creative writings. Create a foil that will highlight the main character's characteristics, either positive or negative. Okay, so I'm dwelling a lot with foil because it's kind of challenging to understand for some. But of course, for the protagonist and the antagonist, obviously it's easy. If you have questions, just grab your mic. You don't need to type kasi hindi ko siya makikita agad. So just grab your mic and ask questions. But while wala pa kayong question, let's just proceed. Now, there are two types of characters in general, regardless of them being protagonist, antagonist, or foil. These two types of characters are, of course, the round characters and the flat characters. Anong pinagkaiba nila? The round characters are dynamic, fully developed character that recognizes changes with or adjusts to the circumstances. So that means a round character is somebody in the story who has developed from the conflict to resolution. So that means there is a development in terms of qualities, in terms of personality, in terms of realization, epiphany, all of this. So round characters are usually the protagonists or also the antagonist, but mostly the protagonist. So these are characters with plot twist, sabi nga nila in our day and age, di ba? Nagka-plot twist ka na ba? Ibig sabihin, nagbago na ba yung direction ng buhay mo? Parang ganun. Round characters are the ones who develop, are the ones who show weakness to strength, the ones who show pain to suffering, or maybe pain to joy, or maybe the opposite. It can be a good start, but developing into a bad ending for tragic films or tragic stories. So that's still considered round characters as long as there is a development. Now, flat characters does not grow and remain the same. So these flat characters are very stereotypical. So sila yung mga character na hindi nagbabago, yun lang talaga yung role nila. Mang-asar, probably, maging maging masungit, or yun lang. It won't change. So these are flat characters. So it's easily distinguishable in films because you would see a lot of the flat characters playing the role of someone, maybe a foil, maybe as well hindi, but playing the role of somebody who's just there to be that kind of person. Hindi na siya magbabago. So yun na siya. Yun na yung pinaka-stereotype sa kanya. So stereotypical siya. So these are two types of characters. Okay. Keep your questions coming along the way. I want to review what we talked about recently on the 5 ways of revealing literary characters before the main gist of it para lang ma-refresh tayo. Again, what are these 5 ways of revealing literary characters? I mentioned this in your introduction to fiction. We have what the characters do in the given circumstances. So you will know the character is revealed through what he or she is doing. Anong actions, anong decisions ang meron siya in the story. Number 2, how the characters are described. Maybe described by the writer, maybe described through the other characters as well. So, okay, sorry. There you go. So there, how the characters are described. Number 3, what the characters say or think through the dialogues, through the lines. You will identify the kind of character he or she is. Okay, so masungit ba siya? Very pessimistic ba siya? Is this character suicidal or depressed? Is this character ignorant or very intelligent? It is through the lines, through the dialogues. What other characters say about them? So maybe the character was not described by the author, but he or she was described by another character. So you can also use that to identify the character. And lastly, what the author says about them. That's the most common. If the author, especially in classics or in traditional writings, if you have read classic novels like Les Miserables, my favorite, and other classics, it's usually the author who describes the character. Okay, Jean Valjean is blah 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 blah. Fantine is this and that. So it's the author. But of course, in modern day literature, there are different ways of describing characters, not just through the author's words. Okay, so that's why number 1 to 4 is also important. Okay, I gave this as an example. So ulitin ko lang, baka kasi hindi nyo napanood yung video. And I'm very deliberate about this example, Summer Solstice, because this is part of your final paper. Okay, so ginagamit ko na siyang example para maging familiar na kayo because mahaba yung kwento and it would take time for you to read. So that's why I'm giving you already examples for you to have a clue. Okay, so from Summer Solstice, look at this. The couple, Don Paeng and Doña Lupeng, had an exchange of argument towards the end, the latter part of the story. And in this story, we know that Doña Lupeng wanted to be renowned as a woman with freedom and high regard in society because back then in the 50s, alam natin that in the Philippines, women are considered secondary in terms of social class. Okay, hopefully hindi na ngayon, 21st century na, but sexism is very rampant during the time. And Doña Lupeng actually, through her actions and dialogues, her words rather, tried to criticize the society, Philippine society. And this is an interesting part. In the end, sabi dito ni Don Paeng, I am your dog, your slave. Doña Lupeng answered, but it was still not enough. Her fists were still clenched and she cried, then come crawl on the floor and kiss my feet. Okay, look at the kind of angst. Diba? So parang Doña Lupeng in this dialogue is actually not just showing power as a woman, but medyo bordering on medyo ano na siya, no? Medyo may sabi nga nila medyo pagka-assertive na siya, pagka-obsessive. But it shows the kind of reaction Doña Lupeng had because of the years of oppression sa mga kababaihan. That's why medyo uminit na yung ulo niya. Of course, the story is so long, but I'm just using this as an example for characterization. And by looking at these lines, you know that you can describe Doña Lupeng using these two dialogues lang, no? These two exchanges. You will have a glimpse on what kind of woman she is or she turns out to be. From being mahiyain, being sunod-sunuran, submissive in the beginning, she developed to becoming fierce and powerful, quote unquote, extra powerful. And that's as well as considered, excuse me, that is also considered as a round character. So makikita niyo yung development ni Doña Lupin from point A to point B. So a good example of round character. Now, in the contemporary and popular times, we know Harry Potter is a very popular literary piece. Whether you're reading or watching Harry Potter, let's try to take a look at these two examples. First example, he was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck. Okay, try to imagine that. Although he did have a very large mustache, Mrs. Dursley ba yan? Dursley was thin and blunt and had nearly twice the usual amount of neck. The usual amount of neck, which came in very useful as she spent so much of her time craning over garden fences, spying on the neighbors. Page 1. Look at how the author described. This is an example of how the author describes a character. It's kind of funny, di ba? Even the neck, wala daw pa. May double chin siguro siya, hindi kita yung leeg niya, what have you. But very creative. Okay, so that's an example, a classic example of describing a character through the author. Look at page 46. A giant of a man was standing in the doorway. His face was almost completely hidden by a long, shaggy mane of hair and a wild, tangled beard. But you could make out his eyes, glinting like black beetles under all the hair. Another example of how the characters are described through the author's words. Okay, so by these descriptions, these adjectives, these words used in the description, you can activate your mental picture. You can imagine the kind of character he is, even without watching the film. Through the words in the literary piece, gagana agad yung imagery, di ba? Yung mental image na i-describe agad yung haba ng balbas niya, yung size ng katawan niya, and so on and so forth. Okay, so for creative writers, creative writing aspirants there, these are good examples that you can employ in your writing style. I'm not sure if you have taken creative writing already or if you have that subject, but it's interesting. Okay, moving forward, let's continue talking about characterization. So just to sum up the definition, characters always reveal the significant human experience of a real life. Okay. Hello? Okay. Nawala ata ako. Okay, moving forward. Just to sum up this definition of characterization, characters always reveal the significant. Okay, good. Thank you. Characters always reveal the significant human experience of a real life person. Wants, struggles, joys, pains, conflict, actions, etc. So if you just joined this session, I mentioned in the beginning that this is what we call vicarious experience or experiencing from the experience of others. So we call it in Aristotle's term, significant human experience. So we are not the characters, but we feel on behalf of the character. That is vicarious. Vicarious means to identify with someone else's feeling. Not just in literature, but even in real life. If you have a friend who goes through a certain low point in his or her life, you are not experiencing the same thing, but you cry with him, you cry with her. Okay, that's vicarious. You feel the pain on behalf of the character, on behalf of the person you are helping. Okay, now just to add to, to add in your imagination, to add the significant human experiences impact in one's life, I'm sure that all of you, whether you are a literature student or just an ordinary anime lover or cartoon lover, animation battle, you are all familiar with this one. Of course, Sarah ang munting prinsesa. I know the example is a bit medyo shallow, no? But it drives home the point. Character development, round character from being a princess to being a street beggar, a street vendor. Actually, naging katulong pa siya, tagabalat ng patatas if you may. You know, I have a comment with the pagbabalat ng patatas, no? I don't know, sorry for this one, why pagbabalat ng patatas in Princess Sarah was highlighted as the character of Sarah. But if you watch the entire story, there were actually only four times na nagbalat ng patatas si Sarah. And mas marami pa siyang ibang ginawa, tulad ng paglilinis, pagbili sa palengke, so on and so forth. Pero hindi ko alam ba't yung pagbabalat ng patatas yung na-highlight. No? So, konti lang naman yon. Anyways, so other than Sarah being a round character, when you talk about significant human experience, as a child, you grow up feeling the pain of this character from being a good person who's very rich and famous to being still a good person, but experiencing all the things that actually hindi niya deserve, diba? And because of that, a lot of people, a lot of children back then they felt bad for what happened in the story. That's considered not just a round character, but we call it the vicarious experience. So we feel the significant human experience of Sarah, and we cry with her, we identify with her. So that's it. Now, I want to give different aspects of characterization just to thicken our discussion on characters, because this is necessary for your activity, which is Dead Stars by Paz Marquez Benitez. I'm sure, I hope you have read the story already. If not, at least you have watched the short film version. Pero I would still encourage you to read kasi you need the descriptions in the text. Okay, so let's talk about the different aspects of characterization. Aspect number 1 is physical. How do we identify characters other than the descriptions through the author, through the other characters, the dialogues? We also look at different physical. Oh, wala ba ako? Okay, so we also have to look at different aspects of characterization, and one of which, what's happening?
Sir, naririnig naman namin kayo, sir. Naririnig kita, sir.
Hold on, ah. Okay. I'm back. Okay, I think I'm back. I don't know what's happening. Maybe
Yes, sir.
the rain. So bago pumasok yung bagyo, tapusin na natin. Okay. So going back to what I said, different aspects of characterization. So one is physical, very basic. While waiting for the PowerPoint, no. So when you talk about physical aspect of characterization, we're looking at gender, the age, if it's described in the text. We look at the size. Okay. I'm not sure if it's a politically correct term. What's happening? Wait lang. The network. Okay. Struggle. Anyways, thank you for bearing with me. Size, so that means the physical size of the character. So it can be a fat character, a slim character. So that matters in the description as well. What's happening? Other physical attributes that were not mentioned, such as physical deformities, imperfections, all of the minute details of the physicality of the character can also be attributed to the physical aspect of characterization. So when you watch a film or you read a text, careful with these descriptions because it matters how the writer So how the writer describes the character. Uh, I hate when this happens, but I have to continue. Okay, an example of that in a popular novel that was turned as a film and a musical as well is what we know as the Phantom of the Opera. Okay, you know that the Phantom of the Opera or the Phantom himself is wearing a mask. And in terms of physical aspect, you know that the character is trying to hide something underneath the mask. Diba? That's why hindi naman siguro kailangan mandire but may ipapakita akong picture, nakita yung mata ha, so wag kayong pikit na lang pag matatakotin. Okay, that's why this one when it was revealed sa isang character si Kristen Day, so nakita niya yung deformity ng character that the reason the Phantom is isolating himself, the reason the character is hiding in the corners of the theater, it's because he is ashamed of how he looks. That's part of the physical aspect of characterization. So the author deliberately used this kind of description because it drives home a point. At the same time, this is where the entire story will be revolving around because of his imperfection, because of his insecurities. So he tried to grapple power and manipulate people and even a woman and so on and so forth. So that's the power of physical aspect of characterization. So in the physical aspect, you look at the physical characteristics and identify how it's connected to the development of the story. Aspect number two, we have what we call the social aspect. These are economic status, profession, maybe religion, family, relationship, and so on and so forth. So who is the character connected with talks a lot about his or her social aspect. An example of that in Philippine literature is, of course, Doña Victorina. Doña Victorina in Noli Me Tangere is an example of a social climber. Okay, so wanting to belong to this circle, to this economic progressive circle. And Doña Victorina was or is the wife of Don Tiburcio. And through the not just the physical characteristic, no, but through her projection in the novel of Jose Rizal, you would know that this is a representation of a lot of Filipinos, quote unquote. Okay, I'll be careful with this. A lot of Filipinos who are also social climbers, Filipinos who wanted to be attributed or attached, linked to prominent people because that gives them value, that gives them high regard in society. Okay, so that is considered a social aspect of character. Okay, of course, you can think of other examples in literature. In Dead Stars, let's say, if you look at the character of Alfredo and Esperanza and Julia, the love triangle, which I will ask you to work on later on, you can identify the social aspect of these three characters. Where do they belong in terms of economic status? What kind of profession they have? What kind of family relationships or religious beliefs do they espouse in the story? So these are clues to understand the characters. Okay. Later, if you have questions, we'll talk about it. Number three, second to the last, is that's a picture of Dorian Gray. Uh, psychological. Psychological aspects talks about habitual responses, attitudes, desires, likes and dislikes, motivations, intellectual and emotional attributes. If you are not familiar with the story, this classic story, Picture of Dorian Gray by, oops, sorry, wait lang. Okay, by Oscar Wilde, this character here is very obsessed with the idea of beauty and aesthetics. He painted several paintings that he became quote unquote in love with, okay, passionate with, to the point that he parang he incurred this kind of mental sickness that he is very obsessed with perfection and beauty. And I will not spoil the story because I want you to read that if you have your free time. But that's an example of a psychological aspect. There's this line in the novel that says, "The reason I will not exhibit this picture is that I am afraid that I have shown in it the secret of my own soul." So the painting of his own being, he became obsessed and in love with that to the point that he cannot separate his painting of himself to himself. That's why he doesn't want that painting to be sold or to be exhibited. Kasi feeling niya people will understand him because of the painting, and ayaw niyang makilala siya, ayaw niyang malaman yung mga secrets niya. Okay, so an example of psychological aspect. Careful with how characters behave. Okay, because we know that the behavior that the characters are trying to portray in the story reveal a lot about their psychological um, aspects. Okay, so may mental health issue ba si character, or meron ba siyang like emotional distress, let's say, or anxiety, and so on and so forth. Lastly, in the aspect, although it can also be considered psychological, but it can also merge with what we call moral. Okay, moral aspect of the character talks about decisions influenced by their beliefs and their moral dilemma. Okay, and obviously, if you have seen Joker or maybe read that before, we know that it's an example of a psychologically struggling character, which affects his moral standards, his morality, or his idea of good and bad. So naglalaro siya between psychological and moral. Now I put a parenthesis on the word moral because I don't want us to think that morality is something that is just espoused through a certain religion or belief. So that's basically debatable. That's why it's in the parenthesis. So maybe ethical. I don't know what's the proper term for this one, but you know what I'm talking about. So that kind of moral dilemma is espoused by the character. Okay. So again, just to recap, the four aspects of characterization, we have the physical, the social, the psychological, and the moral aspect